welcome to Viewpoints, brought to you by Equiture, the leading provider of public safety software and training. My name is Cherie Bartram, and I will be your host today. A little bit about us before we get started. We are an international leader in public safety training and software technology with products geared toward providing tools to help responders stay safe and educated. For those of you who are new, we offer monthly podcasts with a variety of guests geared toward public safety topics, as well as monthly webinars through Viewpoints and diverse offering of training courses through our apprentice platform. I encourage you to check that out as well. Today on our show, we are talking with Kris Kaull, an inspiring ninja who's remarkably inflexible. Kris Kaull is a tech enthusiast with an insatiable passion for helicopters, shallow television, and 80s music. Around the time that Al Gore invented the internet, Kris started paramedic.com, and in 2007, he co-founded EMS1.com. So while most people view Kris as the next undiscovered artist, he feels more at home making positive changes in EMS than listing his accomplishments. So I'm not going to go into all of them, but there are many. Kris is currently a partner in the Red Flash Group, the leading communications and strategy firm in public safety. I think you are going to find his journey and his discussion today interesting, and his stories are entertaining. Welcome to the show, Kris.
Oh, man. Cherie, thank you for having me. This will be great. I'm excited.
I'm so glad you're joining with us today. When Carrie and I talked to you the other day about your journey, you had so many great stories just bubbling out of you. I'm not sure we have time today to really do you justice.
Yeah, we're going to dig in. We'll have a good time. I think that you guys have a lot to offer, and maybe we'll walk out of here just thinking about the world a little bit differently.
Right. Well, so let's just jump right in. With all the things you have, what about your work do you enjoy most, right now? Like, and why?
That's such a, um, I would say that I'm blessed that I feel like I haven't worked a day in my life.
Ah,
And although I would argue that my sophomore and junior year in high school working at Taco Bell uh, was not the same as my career. However, my degrees in technology and in marketing, and also I was an EMT, a field training officer, a paramedic, a fire training captain on the fire department, and so 30 years in public safety. And when I look back, you mentioned DMS1.com, you mentioned paramedic.com, you mentioned um, strategy and communications. I always think that just the way I'm built and the way my mind works, that if I was just doing one thing, I don't know if I would be super happy. So the times that I didn't practice medicine, and I still occasionally still pick up flight shifts on a helicopter covering Southwest Montana, um, about one shift a week. I think that the times that I wasn't practicing medicine or responding to calls and was focused more on large scale, big projects across the US and beyond, I felt like I was making a big difference, but I wasn't, there was something missing tangibly. And uh, when if I was the flip of that and instead was only responding to calls, I would feel like I'm hanging out this patient, this patient, this patient, but I'm not making as big of a difference as I could. Um, and so putting them together is the right balance for me. It may not be for everybody, but I feel like it's just as important that I feel like I'm making a difference globally. And also I'm still tangibly holding somebody's hand during their worst day and walking alongside of them. And that mix there is my favorite part. And I think after 30 years, finally have the perfect balance of that.
Oh, I love that. I completely understand wanting to always be able to juggle. It's what makes you tick.
Yeah, exactly
Yeah.
right. Exactly right.
So, with all that, is there a fun fact that you have that most people don't know?
Um, such a good question. I would say the fun fact, or at least this is what my wife tells people that is my fun fact, is that I'm actually pretty fancy. I'm a pretty fancy dresser. I'm a paramedic, but I'm very cerebral. I'm in marketing, a writer, those type of things. And so I spend the majority of my time behind a computer at a desk or publicly speaking or doing that. But my fun fact is that I'm actually really, really handy, like really handy. I can fix most things. The things I cannot fix, I'll tell you the list that I can't fix. I cannot fix HVAC systems, air conditioning, compression, don't understand that. And both small engines and large engines, not a fan. But outside of that, from computers to houses to framing, concrete, whatever, drywall, wiring, network wiring, I'm super handy.
Wow.
And people are always surprised. Yeah,
Well, that's because those two things don't really go together.
right,
You know,
right.
yeah, that's very
Yeah.
cool. I could, I could ask more questions, but we have so much to cover that I'm just gonna just say, wow, that's cool. Um, well, all right. So one of the things we talked about is that you're a national speaker. And then one of those things that you speak on is human factors. So I'm really interested to hear about that. What can you talk to a little bit about that?
Yeah. Human factors, just in general, are the things that cause us to make decisions perfectly, inaccurately, whatever. It doesn't matter. But it's all the stuff that's in our head, right? It's the I come onto shift, or you go to the doctor's office. You think that you'd hope the doctor or nurse is on the best day and they're well slept and they're well fed and they're at their best. But the truth is, they may be going through stuff as well, right? And so all these human factors really dig into who we are and how we connect with the rest of the world. It's particularly important when you're talking about emergency responders and digging in and understanding human factors of how we respond and how we take care of each other during those high critical incident times, right? And it was a couple of years ago now, and I was reading, I had stumbled across an article by a colleague of mine, and the colleague of mine shared the article. It's by Shane Parrish from Farnham Street. He's a ex-CIA type person. When I say type, he's Canadian, so whatever the equivalent of CIA is. And he has really focused his life around what is the best practices others do out there and how can I relate them to my life. And this one actually wasn't a podcast of his, but it was an article. And the article was between him and this gentleman by the name of Adam Robinson. Adam, if that name sounds familiar, he's a chess master, a grandmaster chess player. He's world renowned as far as an investment strategist. But the article was talking about something that Adam has been digging into, and it was how not to be stupid. And the first side of that is like, oh, whoa, that seems very dismissive. But the very first paragraph in this article is, first of all, let's define stupidity. Like, it's not the lack of intelligence. It's not being dumb. That's not what he's saying. He's saying stupidity is overlooking or dismissing critical information because of the surrounding or systems that you're in. And I think about that because I'll give you an easy example. When you have all these things in your mind and you're running to the store to grab milk really quick and you rock up and you run into the door. And then you look and it says pulled, not pushed. Well, we know that the door swings in and out. We know how to use the door. We certainly have the intelligence to read the four letters, right? It has nothing to do with that. We walked into that door and made a mistake, not because in and out of a door, not because of the complexity of the world, but because our head was somewhere else and we were thinking of other things, and then, or the system was set up incorrectly so that we ran to the door. We made a mistake. And I look back and I would say, as first responders, 911, police, fire, EMS. I'll speak mostly to EMS because that's where I spent the majority of my career, but you can extrapolate this to being a mom, a college student, it does not matter. That stupidity, I would define it as the cost of intelligence when operating in a complex environment. And when I ran an ambulance service many years ago, I had a crew that had a diabetic patient. And the diabetic patient, you give them sugar. So they checked the blood sugar. Blood sugar is really low. They were going to start an IV, give them sugar. And as she turned to her partner, she asked for the medication. He was a brand new EMT, gave her the medication. She grabbed it and she pressed that medication and nothing happened. Then she went back and looked and she had given him another medication, sodium bicarb, not D50 or glucose. Certainly, there are rules that we do of the rights, like is it the right patient, the right dose, double checking, doing all these things, these controls in place. However, along those lines, there was also another issue. And the other issue was because we do a lot of backcountry medicine, the operations manager of the service, have pulled all of our medications out of their boxes and put them into a much smaller pack that is mobile. But by doing that, these two medications are the exact same Burstajet, the same size, the width, coloring. They're both clear medication inside of them. That unless in an emergency you're looking and double checking and reading the fine print, they look identical. In their boxes, one's brown, one's blue. They're real big. You would never grab the brown box. You'd grab the blue box. But it was because of a systems issue. Certainly, of course, I mentor them, right? If it happens once, that's just once. If it happens again, it's a trend, then we can certainly have verbal warnings, education, training, maybe up to including termination. But let's start with the system first. And the system was set up for them to fail and didn't put controls in place. And we see this over and over and over again in critical areas. And in aviation, it's called the Swiss cheese effect, where at any time, if you have one slice of Swiss cheese, there's a lot of holes. A lot of failures can happen. But then when you put a second slice of Swiss cheese there, a lot of those holes are blocked up and there's only a couple that still get through. And the more slices of Swiss cheese, the more fail safes that you have, the harder to get through it is. And so I was noodling on this as I'm reading this article. And I think we want to dig into this, but let me just end this part and with they listed 7 risk factors that cause you to make stupid mistakes. Being in a rush, being outside of your normal environment, being in the presence of a group, being in the presence of an expert or being that expert, tasks that require intense focus, information overload, or physical or emotional stress or fatigue. And so I'll ask you, Cherie, like, if you listed those 7 things, like, what do you think of when I say being in a rush, outside of your normal environment, presence of a group, or being an expert or around an expert, tasks that require intense focus, information overload, physical or emotional stress or fatigue?
Well, you're describing our normal work environment.
Exactly, right? Like for me, I was like, wait, that's just the job application, like description of the environment we work in
Yeah.
public safety. And so I'm like, well, of course there's going to be mistakes. That's the first thing, right? Is to identify like, oh, we work in an area that all these different things added up cause us to make mistakes. And it's really simple math. It's if you can mitigate them like Swiss cheese, mitigate all 7, the chances you're going to make a mistake are less. If you can mitigate 4 or 5 of them, and you have 2 left, that's great. If you can't mitigate any of them, the chances that you're going to make a critical error, get injured, or something bad will happen is high. And so it's really simple that says, let's just identify these 7 areas and what can we put in as controls in our work environment to help us make less mistakes.
And so what you were talking about is something that was put in place to help, like, hey, let's take this medication out of its box so that it's quicker to grab, actually wasn't helpful.
Right. It
And
was
that kind of thing happens all the time.
all the time. And so in aviation, they call it just culture, which is instead of first blaming you of being a bad soul or bad person or dumb, first let's look at the system. Is the system set up to fail? Like, is this, and I had contributed to that system because yes, we can address this one team, but that same event could easily happen again and again and again unless we fixed the underlying problem, right? So my thought was, and it's up to you, but what I like to do is maybe go through those 7. We listed them off quickly, so let's spend some time and we'll just talk about those 7 risk factors that we would want to mitigate, right? If there's 7 factors that contribute to making stupid mistakes, what are those 7? And are there things you could put in your life, whether it's in your career or in your personal life, to help minimize errors? And so we'll start with the first one, being in a rush. And as you know, and probably many of the listeners here, we work in public safety, and there's a thing of moving with intent or moving consistently, but we rarely run, right? We don't run. If you ever saw us in an ambulance and you have 2 ambulances coming up at the same time and one coming up flies in, they're talking on the ambulance and they're talking on the radio like, we're here, tin foil, and they jump out and they're grabbing their gear, but their gear is, the bag's not zipped. So as they're running in to take care of Cherie, all the bandaging is falling out and the car's rolling away because they never put the ambulance in park. You're like, yeah, they don't ooze control, right? They're in a rush. But you see other responders, law enforcement and fire, or the 911 world, where you say, hey, I know you're really excited, but let's just, and you're really upset and you're really frustrated, but like, what's the nature of emergency? What's your phone number? Like, we walk through with intent. And so the same thing, you get on scene, you put your vehicle in park, you grab all your gear, you walk in together, and you slow that pace down. And I think that's just a huge opportunity for us to make less mistakes. In medicine, because that's what I can speak to, we actually do these things called timeouts, where right before we're going to do a high risk and low volume event, meaning something that has a lot of challenges around it, but we don't do it very often. When we get all set up and ready, we'll do a timeout. We're like, okay, if this doesn't work, do we have a backup airway? Do we have backup medication? Do we have suction? We just slow down, double check everything, make sure everybody's on board, and then we walk in and we take care of the patient systematically. And that's been known to reduce errors.
I would say 911, it probably shift change. We see people
Mm,
being in a rush a lot. I want out the door. I've got this event going on in my personal life. So you don't do pass on very well, or you don't tell your relief person about that call that's sitting and pending that needs to be
mm,
dispatched out. Um,
yep. Or
Instead
as
of
we've
taking that
gotten
brush.
used to things, well, instead of, you have EMD, you have different systems and stuff, and it's always like going back to the basics and not missing. And you're in a rush, so you just kind of skip around. And those are opportunities to introduce errors for sure.
Yeah.
But I like what you said, the get off shift-itis, the get out of here-itis of wanting to get out. And because of that, you're in a rush.
Right. Yeah. That's a pretty good factor.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. The second one, they said being outside your normal environment. And this one could be tough for people. They say, well, my normal environment is abnormal, right? I work on a helicopter. I fly backcountry. I fly to rural community access hospitals. I fly that. However, I think that that's my normal environment. I think that anytime that I'm outside of that, or knowing that my normal environment is abnormal, knowing that every day you come in dispatch, or every day you're responding to the stack pending calls of law enforcement, fire, every day is different because not every call is the same. And what controls do you put in place knowing that, right? And for me, uh, I check out all my gear. I mean, it's a standard, but people can be sloppy. I check out all my gear and I set up everything exactly how I want it. I lay out my flight suit. I actually put my stethoscope. I put my stuff exactly where I want it in the helicopter. There's a lot of things we do before we lift, of checking weather, grabbing our blood, we have all these things that we need to do. And while I'm doing those, I don't need to also be running around saying, oh, where's my wallet? I need my wallet. Where's my stethoscope? I need it. So I try to organize and take control of all the things I can take control of so that I can focus on the abnormal and not be focused on stuff that I can mitigate. And for you, I think we'll get into checklists in a bit, but I think you could tell me about how do you make sure that you're consistent and you've normalized or structured the things you can structure when every call that comes in is different.
Well, I think it's this, just like you just described, when you first sit down at your console, but sometimes it might be a little different. I mean, sometimes you don't have that moment of normalcy. When you come in at shift change, there is no normal. I mean, you come in and you hardly get to do pass on. The phones are ringing crazy. You don't have time to adjust your keyboard, adjust your chair, get your computer screen just the way you want it because the phones are ringing. So you're immediately outside your normal environment because you didn't have a chance to set your computer and your screens up the way you like them.
Yeah. Well,
So,
and so the answer to that would be being aware that it's not quite set. The screens aren't, I like this window here. I like this. I like the height of the table. I want all these things set you up to be optimum when you don't have the time to do that. Just simply being aware of, I'm not operating on this. I need to pay particular attention to what's going on because I'm not settled yet in my job in these first few minutes swapping, right?
right,
I get that.
until I can get it the way I want it,
Yeah,
which, depending on the night, the jurisdiction, it may take you an hour or
yeah,
two,
yeah, yeah.
right?
So there's just an awareness that that is just one, right? Like none of these are fail safe. That's why I always say the Swiss cheese uh, analogy is that we're not trying to block all errors. We're trying to put controls in place. And sometimes the control is just saying, hey, I'm not feeling that good today, or I'm just a little under the weather. I'm not just being aware that I'm not at my optimum and sharing with the fellow uh, dispatchers in the room of like, hey, you might need to back me, double check me on a couple things if you have an opportunity for sure. What goes to the next one? What's interesting is being in the presence of a group can actually increase level of errors. And there's this group dynamic where this almost, let's say there's three of us together, there's almost this fourth personality that emerges. And then there's a different dynamic where I'm with two other people, there's a fourth, it always changes. And what we found is that uh, in group settings, we tend to rely and assume that other people know more than we do, and we were scared to speak up, especially and I'll put this together with the next one, which is being in the presence of an expert or being that expert. And there was a TED talk out of Montana. And so for those of you guys who aren't in Montana, Montana State University, I live in Bozeman, Montana, home of Montana State. We actually have a snow sciences program. You can get a 4-year degree in snow. And while I think that's normal, it's not. So I'll just clarify. And this gentleman, Dr. Jordy Hendricks, spoke, did a TED talk about human factors. And he actually brought it back to a young gal named Olivia Buchanan, 23-year-old, uh, top of their class, was in her master's program there, had already gotten her undergrad in snow sciences, and she went backcountry skiing and ultimately perished in a avalanche. And they're like, but she should know, right? Or she was the best. She's the one who trained this. And what was interesting is when they went back and looked at the group, she wasn't guiding. If she was guiding with people that were less experienced, she would have probably taken all those precautions and walked them through and made sure that everybody was safe. But she was actually skiing with a number of other experts, a number of other group of guides. And so then you're like, well, I'm not sure. I mean, if all those guys think it's safe, then it probably is safe, right? And so you start, and you could see this in law enforcement, in fire, in EMS. Of it's hard to like stand up and say, wait, I think something's wrong, or my gut says it's not right, or I'm a little worried that we need to do something different. And I actually went back to my own practice, and this is where that self-awareness comes from. And I'm like, you know what? I actually fly with a great pilot who at that time was a commander in the U.S. Navy and flew in the Captain Phillips. He was one of the commanding officers in the Captain Phillips Somalia pirate thing when he flew in the Navy. And I flew with this flight nurse who we had the same shifts all the time. What was interesting is that after I was reading this article, I'm like, you know what? I never double check those guys. I think they're so good at what they do that I just assume they're not going to make a mistake. But when I have a relief pilot or a pilot from another base who I don't know, or I have a brand new nurse that I've never worked with before, I'm double checking. Do we have 2 inches to fly? Do we have all of our, I'm following and I'm double checking each other, making sure that we're really great. So even in my own practice, I was like, wow, I actually get laxed when I'm comfortable with the team that I'm working with. And that is an opportunity to make poor decisions or make decisions because you're like, well, I'm with such a good group, they never fail, and you let your guard drop.
Well, I just have a quick question about that. So you're in your normal group. How would they feel if you double checked them? Would they be like, "Geez, Kris, like, don't you trust us?"
Well, it's a conversation we need to have in public safety, right? We really come from a paramilitary machismo. You're a rookie. Shut up and be quiet. When I went in here, we actually were in fire trucks where the seats were backwards. Like you clean the toilet. When you're at my spot and you've been here long enough, then you can make the decisions. But if you have time to lean, you have time to clean. Uh, that's, the way I was raised. I do think that dynamic across all of our different channels, whether it's 911, fire, law, or EMS, it's starting to change a little bit. Um, However, in healthcare, it's a big deal because we've known, and you were just talking about transitioning between patient care, transitioning with a pending 911 call and switching. It's the number one reason that errors happen with patients in the hospital, and more errors happen inside the hospital than at home. And it's crazy. The number of fixable errors in a hospital is around 40,000 a year, which is the same number as gun violence and deaths, breast cancer, and motor vehicle crashes, right? And these are all during transitions of care when they're both one's coming off shift, one's coming on, and they're missing and they don't have a full set. So we're putting controls in place, and we do that. We actually put checklists. We'll talk about that here in a sec, but we put checklists that before we lift, the pilot's like, do you have your blood, meds, stuff? And we double check. Do you have seatbelts on? Do you have this? And then we ask back, do you have 2 inches to fly? Are all your things in the green? And then we're double checking each other. And so we set that up as a culture and an expectation and have really taken, I would actually say the opposite, that instead of being uh, frustrated or hurt that somebody's questioning me, saying the best of the best out there are using best practices. And if I want to be in the Navy, it's one thing, but if I want to be a Navy SEAL, then I need to attach myself to those. And that's where we see in flight medicine that like these are best practices that are tried and true. And if we say that we want to be the best, then we need to put into practice these things that help keep us safe. Along these lines, and you may have seen this as well, is being in the presence of an expert or being that expert. And I remember as a field training officer, I was once precepting a new medic, and I disagreed with his care. Turns out he was right. And what he did is something that I told him was great, which he's like, I don't agree, Kris. I think we should go down this path. It was an elderly gentleman. He has difficulty breathing. I was thinking it was respiratory. He was thinking congestive heart failure. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to disagree with you and I'm going to go this way on this path. I'm like, you do whatever. I actually probably gave him some grief about it, but he stood up for what he believed and he was right. And his path of medicine was perfect. And I told him that, but I share that story because that doesn't happen very often, especially when you're being tested or precepted and somebody's training you to be like, I don't agree, right? Or I think that's not right. And to stand up, I mean, your job's on the line, people are quote unquote grading you. And yet, and we see that throughout healthcare, that somebody's like, we rely on that physician or that nurse, when in reality, they might be off on their care and their thoughts. And so just being in the presence of an expert or being around an expert doesn't mean you need to like all of a sudden assume that things are wrong, but it's the opposite. Don't assume that they have it all together and you still need to be a critical thinker. And I think these areas like being in a group, being an expert, we let our guard down and bad things happen when we let our guard down.
Well, and that advice can go back at the expert too. Just because you are an expert doesn't mean you're always right.
I think that as we look back at our career, and you can probably name those bosses, or they might only have been colleagues, but you're like, they're really good at what they do, and I want to emulate and be like them. And then you've had those other bosses or colleagues that you're like, yeah, I would have a problem with that leadership style as well. Like I have a frustration with that. And I personally, however, I think this is a theme, people who look up to their leader or their mentor or the person who's helping grow them, they have a sense of humility of like, I have skin knees because of all my experience. I have these years of education, but I am learning every day from every person. And there's a level of humility of those who are really, really good at what they do. There's a level of humility there that we all tend to gravitate to. So I agree.
Yeah. Right.
I think I'm going to put the next two together, and that is tasks that require intense focus and information overload. And if there's anything in our industry of public safety and areas that can cause us to make mistakes, it's because of all the information. What do they call it? Notification fatigue, right? You're getting the radio's on and the noise is going on and somebody's talking over the radio. And then there's a family that's mad or angry and there's other things outside. There's all this information and stuff coming in. And at the same time, we are required with intense focus to perform. And there's a couple things here that I really like. One is I had a medical director once tell me, practice does not make perfect, practice makes better. And there's really no focus or interest in being perfect because this exact scenario will not be the same. It'll be some variation of this cardiac event or this difficult breathing, but practice makes better. When I was going to paramedic school, you kind of graduate to these different levels of first just learn the pathophysiology in the book. Then learn the skills, how to start an IV, how to draw up medication. Then you learn how to read the ECG or how to use the equipment. And then you slowly work through. And ultimately what you do is you do a scenario. And that's putting it all together. The education, the physical skills and understanding of the equipment and how the patient's presenting, and then making critical care decisions. And one of the areas that I thought was really interesting is when I went to take my final exam, it was in a small bedroom, like a closet, and there was and I had all my gear, and there was a mannequin in there, and the physician who was my instructor at that time said, okay, you went up to the top of the building and you're in an elevator now heading back down, and you got a refusal from your patient. Okay. And they say, but the one guy, the mannequin that's in this little broom closet with me, he's starting to have chest pain. So now I'm by myself and I don't have my partner, and it's just me and this guy. So I start treating for chest pain. Well, then he goes into cardiac arrest. So now I have to intubate, start IVs, do CPR, all these things. And then they turn off the lights and hands me a pen light, one of those little pen lights. So now I'm doing it all in the dark. Then he turns up music really loud. I remember it was country music. I'm not sure why I remember it was country music. And then while I'm trying to provide medicine and take care of this patient in this scenario with this loud music, he starts bouncing a basketball and asking me test questions about drug dosages and what's the effect and and all this stuff. And I got out of there. I'm like, whew, that was brutal. And he was like, was it though? Was it more brutal than your first cardiac arrest where you have the knowledge, but it's your first one to manage the whole scene? You have brand new EMTs who've never done this before. You have screaming kids or family who's crying. You have different responders coming in. You have TV blaring. You have other people on the phone ringing. You have all this chaos and all this information overload. And yet you need to require intense focus. And so it's like, we should practice pushing our boundaries so they're more in line with what we actually see out there. And I thought that was, I appreciate it then nearly as much as I do now when I tell that story.
I like that. And I've used that kind of thought process when testing dispatchers, new dispatchers. Um, it's, oh, shh, they're taking a test. I'm not going to be quiet. Interrupt.
Yeah.
Come on in, talk. And once you get that into the mind of, the people who are helping proctor the test, oh, yeah. Uh, but it's you don't want it to be quiet, because never in the rest of their career, if they pass this scenario testing that they're taking, is it going to be quiet. So I really like that. I like that scenario that you described.
The other thing that we don't, and I think you do a much better job of this in the 911 world, the PSAP world, more than we do, although I do think this is changing now, is checklists and using checklists. And the concept, and this comes from, once again, the aviation industry. And there's a thing called the Checklist Manifesto. It's a book. It was written by Dr. Atul Gawande. And it's a book that says, hey, very simply, there are 3 levels. One is very simple: opening and closing a door, in and out, on and off switch. There are things that are complicated. And then there are things like complex, like raising kids. Right? You can't actually,
Right.
You can raise your first child one way, you know how to raise a kid, and then the next one comes and you raise them the same, and they turn out completely different, right? That's complex. We can't put a checklist on that. We can't put a checklist. We don't need to put a checklist on how to open a door. But there's these complicated things that if we do a checklist, we can walk through and minimize that information overload. And what was interesting is that this has been going on in aviation for years. And you actually see them when you fly domestically. These guys have 10,000 hours, 5,000 hours of flight time in these 737s, and they still have a checklist. They go through it every single time. And we do as well now. And the concept is if I have a checklist and I'm walking through just making sure those, I'm releasing my mind of that information so I can focus on the information that matters. I can focus on the challenges around the patient care, right? I can focus on actually uh, moving, de-escalating verbally the intense emotions on scene, whatever it is, I can focus on that because I don't have to try to also keep everything else in my head. And so that checklist manifesto is something that you're seeing in healthcare to help manage that.
Um, and I know this isn't exactly the same thing, but I had a mentor tell me years ago in supervision. He said, you know, at the end of every day, take just 3 minutes and write down your to-do list. Start it for the next day. He said, because then you're going to go home and you're not going to think about it because you've released it. It's on
Oh,
paper. It's
yeah,
waiting for you. And it's the same
it's the
kind of
same thing.
concept.
Yep.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah, you're releasing your mind instead of trying to keep it up there. You're just like done, open, and then you can actually be a critical thinker, right? And imagine if you had 10 things, but they're on a checklist, and it can be a fire, right? Respond to a motor vehicle crash, and there's these things to chalk the wheels, to do all this, to look for lines, and they're just following this checklist of all the things to stabilize the vehicle. Now they can look at the complexities of how they're going to get the patient out and all the stuff, and their mind's free because they're not trying to remember all their steps in the right order. They're just double checking and walking through the checklist.
Right.
And then the last one, which I do think has been one of topic for the world out there in public safety, is physical or emotional stress and fatigue. And in our medical world, we actually do a risk-based assessment when we come on shift, and then the pilot does one right before every call going out. And it just asks a number of questions like, do I have a head cold or been sick? Is there anything going on in my life that is really impacting me, such as a sick pet, sick child, a recent death, divorce? Did I sleep less than 6 hours the last few days? Have I slept less than 6 hours last night or the last few days? Am I working with a new crew or in a vehicle that isn't my normal vehicle, right? So dispatch, am I picking up the mids shift with people that I'm not used to working with, and I'm sitting at a different desk doing different dispatches? Um, but what it does is it just gives you like maybe you get 1 point for this, 1 point for that, 4 points for this, 7 points for that, three, just different. But what it is, and then when we meet and do our crew check-in in the morning, we know where our risk assessment, and we do it online, and when we do it, our supervisor gets them. Most of the time, they never even catch up. But when, for example, I'm traveling and I'm a little under the weather and I'm picking up an extra shift and certain things just have added up to be pretty high, once it hits from green, it's just a green, yellow, red. Once it kind of moves up to enough points to get in that yellow section, for example, uh, we'll get a call even on a Saturday from our supervisor who lives 7 hours away saying, hey, I'm just checking in. Are you good? Are you all right? And we talk about that with our team, right? Like, hey, I scored kind of high on this. I've been traveling a lot. I feel good, but I'm not in the game like I normally am on a well rested without traveling before shift, all these things. And having that awareness of each other and double checking each other is great. And also focusing to fill our tank up off shift. Uh, you've lived this world for a long time, and one of my challenges, so I won't speak for other helpers out there, I'm using the word helper on purpose, is that my tank a lot of times gets filled up by pleasing others or taking care of others or working with others. Um, and it's hard for me. It seems very selfish of me to focus on me and make sure my tank's filled up in to myself. However, when I look externally, and I'll use the example of a new mom, a brand new mom. Every time the baby's crying, she hasn't slept for 3 weeks. She's there for every time the baby's crying, she's there feeding, nurturing, rocking, doing all the things. And you're like, you know what? Baby's gonna be fine for the next 4 hours. I want you just to go sleep for 4 hours. And you're like, or go get a massage, or just go out and actually hold coffee and be able to drink it when it's still hot, right? Whatever it is for that mom, like when she comes back, if she's well rested, well fed, ready to go, man, she's that much better of a mom. And so I've really changed I used to say yes all the time. Um, and now I make sure that my tank's full first. And it's not selfish. It actually has made me more well-rounded. And I'm actually a better clinician. I'm a better colleague. I'm a better friend. I'm a better spouse, a better dad when my tank's full. And so I can actually give more or give better and give consistently when I'm taken care of. And that looks different. What's that mean to have your tank full? That looks different for everybody, but focusing on making sure our tank is full and that we're doing the stuff to make sure that we are being taken care of is just smart if we want to be in this business for a long time.
That was really interesting. I have never heard of those before, Kris. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing those.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
No, I was going to say like those take home, like you could do that if you are a college student and you're being in a rush, or you're doing this if you are, like I said, a new mom, you could do this for home. But the idea is that no matter how smart you are, uh, our environment is ripe for making mistakes. And we just need to recognize those risks, be aware, mitigate where we can, right? And I think that'll help us to be the best we can be for our community out there.
Right. Yep. Those are really good strategies. And I like that they can be used. I know we talked about them in the realm of public safety, but they are practical for any place.
They're practical for any place. The article was not written for public safety. That's the greatest part about it. He was just assimilating a list of things that have people make poor decisions, right? So I thought it was super interesting how applicable it is to our work environment.
It is. All right. Well, Kris, I do have a big um, something I want you to share with us if you could. We do have a live webinar that we're going to do with you in June 2025. Um, so later this year, and so I don't want you to spoil it, but you are a great storyteller. Um, and you touched on that concept, the very first time we talked, and you talked about your passion for storytelling. Um, and you were talking about funding when people ask for funding, why they don't tell stories. So I'm going to have you save that part until June, uh, so that people can come and join us. But what other places would be a good place to tell stories?
Good questions. Yeah, I think you're right. We just assume people know what we do, or we're valuable to society because of what we do. But most of the time, people don't know what we do. Whether they know that you answer 911, but that's real. They don't know the weight that you carry. They don't know the amount of time you're away from your family. They don't know all these things. And so telling the stories help relay concepts, right? So storytelling is probably that one powerful tool that has been used since biblical times to get concepts and ideas across. And it's the same for education and training our first responders. It Storytelling is used to uh, understand concepts. Storytelling's People do not make decisions and buy things because of stats. They use the stats after their emotions have already decided for them, right? You want to buy that car, you're going to buy that car. But oh, by the way, it gets much better gas mileage than this car, right? I'm using the stats to justify my behavior of buying the car, but I've already bought the car on the emotional side of what I want. Um, so it storytelling is part of what makes us make decisions in almost nearly every aspect of our life. And that's what we're going to talk about is storytelling and the power of storytelling.
All right. So I'm going to take your storytelling and I'm going to tell a story using one of the risk factors because I really think that those two things are important. You know, you can talk about risk factors, but until people can see it. So in your risk factor discussion about being in a rush, you briefly mentioned jumping out of the ambulance and being in a rush and not putting the ambulance in park and it rolling away. So that really happened to me. Uh, my son, when he was in middle school, he ran into a pole playing football, knocked him out cold. Um, the principal and I were on first name basis because, well, she called me a lot about him. And I was in the dispatch center that day. There was two of us. 911, what is the address of your emergency? Is this Cherie? Yes. Cherie, she gave me her name. This is Sandy. And I'm like, oh, what did he do now? She said he ran into a pole. He's unconscious. I said, okay, I didn't do any of the EMD stuff I was supposed to do because that was my baby. Ambulance is on its way, and I hung up. I told my partner, you know, my son is, and he's been on our podcast before too. If he was watching this, he would laugh. Um, I said, dispatch the ambulance to the middle school playground. I jumped in my car. I raced to the playground. I got there before the ambulance. It's a small community in the mountains. Ambulance gets there. They know it's my son because the other dispatcher told them. They jump out, grab their bags. We're in the mountains. The ambulance starts rolling down because everything's mountainy. And I look over, so I'm with my son who is now conscious, but he's out of it because he ran into a pole. And I said, look, the ambulance. It's rolling, and it was rolling right towards, the swing sets where the kids were all standing and still playing. I mean, and so, the media gets a hold of those kind of things and they're like, everybody thinks, oh yeah, stupid ambulance people. But there was so much more to that story.
Yeah,
There was nothing stupid about them. They were in a rush. This was one of their own children, and I just think you made such good valid points today. We just have to slow down, even when it is one of our own, even when we're tired, even when I mean, it was just great. Your information was great, and it brought that story back to me. He ended up being fine, and he had a concussion, but I just really appreciated the information you gave us today.
Yeah, I would like to say that all my stories are because of others, but the truth is, I can tell you story after story where, I've had the virtual or figurative skin knees that have fallen off my bike, because of lessons learned in public safety over the last 30 years of what we could have done better, or that we need to do better, or I need to change my perception, or I need to think differently in order to, or be aware that accidents and safety things happen when there's more risk factors. And if there's 7 of them that we've identified and we can mitigate half of them, then we're going to have less chance of making errors that day. 100%.
Right. Well, thank you again, Kris. I look forward to the webinar with you coming up in June, and remember, audience, to check out our classes that we have through our apprentice at equiture.com. And bye, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us.